Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien, and in this video I'm going to be going over Malcolm X's The Afro-Americans' Right to Self-Defense, a speech he delivered in June 28, 1964. All right, so first I'm going to read the annotation here, the headnote, and then I actually have a video of him reading the actual speech. It's an actual video of him reading it. The imagery is him giving the speech, but only the first big paragraph there, the one that begins the Constitution of. For the second paragraph, I'll just read it and then I'll answer the question. It's a pretty quick thing. But also after that, I have another video about a little bit about the history of the Second Amendment. All right, and its relation to African Americans. So you'll be taking notes on that also. All right, so let's get to the head note. Okay, so below are excerpts from a speech delivered by Malcolm X at the founding rally of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, given in the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. It was about 3 months after Malcolm broke with the Nation of Islam and the OAAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, essentially replaced the short-lived Muslim mosque. He was going completely secular, non-religious. The OAAU was a secular institution that sought to unify 22 million African Americans with the people of the African continent. So Malcolm was taking on a more internationalist scope here. The OAAU was modeled after the Organization of African Unity, a coalition of 53 African nations working to provide a unified political voice for the continent. In the coalition spirit of the OAU, Malcolm sought to reconnect African Americans with their African heritage, to establish economic independence, remember the Black nationalism, and to promote African American self-determination. All right, in line with his views, right? The OAAU was designed to encompass all peoples of African origin in the Western Hemisphere, as well as those on the African continent. Malcolm insisted that progress for African Americans was intimately tied to progress in Africa and outlined a platform of 5 fronts for this progress called the Basic Unity Program. This program called for restoration, reorientation, education, economic security, and self-defense as a means of promoting Pan-African unity and interests. The phrase Pan-African means it just means international. In the below excerpt, and in the founding charter of the OAAU, Malcolm declared African Americans' natural human and U.S. constitutional right to self-defense. Although Malcolm cautioned against using violence indiscriminately or unnecessarily, he steadfastly declared that when blacks were the recipients of violence, they should respond in kind. All right, so let's watch him deliver the beginning of the speech.
Number 2, self-defense. Since self-preservation is the first law of nature, we assert the Afro-Americans' right to self-defense. The Constitution of the United States of America clearly affirms the right of every American citizen to bear arms. And as Americans, we will not give up a single right guaranteed under the Constitution. The history of unpunished violence against our people clearly indicates that we must be prepared to defend ourselves, or we will continue to be a defenseless people at the mercy of a ruthless and violent racist mob.
All right, so that's the first paragraph, and I think you already have your answer. All right, let's look at the second paragraph. We assert that in those areas where the government is either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of our people, that our people are within our rights to protect themselves by whatever means necessary. I repeat, because to me, this is the most important thing you need to know. I already know it. We assert that in those areas where the government is either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of our people, African Americans, that our people are within our rights to protect themselves by whatever means necessary. All right, this I think is actually Malcolm's one of his strongest arguments in favor of his retaliatory self-defense. Right, it's constitutionally guaranteed. All right, that's basically what he's saying. So, what is Malcolm's constitutional argument in favor of self-defense? Second Amendment. And he also makes a historical argument. Right, the hundreds of years of unpunished violence against African Americans just begs them to defend themselves. It makes it obvious to them that they should assert their Second Amendment rights. All right. So the next thing I want to do is show you a short video, a brief little history about the Second Amendment. And there's a little bit of the NRA in here, the National Rifle Association, too, that you're also going to be taking notes on.
Absolutely no reason why out on the street today civilians should be carrying a loaded weapon.
All right, so that was Ronald Reagan in 1967. He was the governor of California at that time. And California was considering and about to approve laws to restrict guns in California.
On May 2nd, 1967, 24 men and 6 women marched into the California State Capitol building in Sacramento. They were carrying pistols, shotguns, and rifles. But this was not a SWAT team or a security force, at least not a government one. In fact, this heavily armed group was more of a well-regulated militia. And they'd come...
Which he used that phrase because that's what the Second Amendment says. All right, that you were allowed to carry guns if part of a well-regulated militia.
To the Capitol that day to try to stop the legislature and the state's Republican governor,
Ronald Reagan,
from passing a law that would strip them of their ability to openly carry their weapons as they patrolled the streets of their neighborhoods in an effort to keep people safe.
They put trumped-up charges of conspiracy and felonies on everyone who went in to exercise a constitutional right and said they had no right to bear arms in a public place. The California Penal Code Section 12020 through 12027 and also the Second Amendment of the Constitution guarantees the citizen a right to bear arms on public property.
So the question you should be asking yourself is why, in 1967, was California acting to restrict the ownership and the brandishing of guns in public?
Now, it may come as a surprise to some of you, given today's discourse on guns, that the National Rifle Association and the Republican governor of California, Ronald Reagan, came out passionately in an effort to strip this militia's right to carry arms.
So that, again, that just complicates the question. Why would a Republican governor, because Republicans are more traditionally in favor of owning guns, more lax gun laws, and the NRA is clearly in favor of lax gun laws. So why are they, in 1967, in favor of restricting ownership of guns?
But I would think that some of the bills that have been suggested, such as not carrying a loaded weapon on a city street or in town, this might certainly be a good one.
And that sounds certainly reasonable. All right.
Why was Ronald Reagan so up in arms? After all, California was an open carry state.
Which means that people were allowed legally to openly carry a loaded weapon, as long as it was not concealed.
These Americans were exercising their God-given Second Amendment rights.
And he's using the phraseology of people who are in favor of more gun ownership or freedom of gun ownership.
So what was the problem?
Am I under arrest? Take your hands off me if I'm not under arrest.
That militia that marched into the Capitol that day was the Black Panther Party.
And we will learn much more about them later in the year. But it's enough to know right now that they were they began in Oakland, California, but they eventually spread nationwide to more urban areas. And you can imagine why, right? Redlining. But anyway, they would carry guns with them if the law allowed them to. They very often would say, follow the police around, and would stand there. If the police pulled over a black person, they would stand there with the weapons in their hand to making sure nothing happened. All right. So this was the mid to late 60s was the beginning of the Black Panther Party.
And the street patrols that they were engaged in were operations to protect their communities from the police and other government forces that had been targeting, abusing, and killing black people.
The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense calls upon the American people in general and the black people in particular to take full note of the racist California legislature, which is now considering legislation aimed at keeping the black people disarmed and powerless at the very same time.
So the answer to your question is Ronald Reagan and the NRA came out in favor of more gun control when it was black people who were holding the guns.
That racist police agencies throughout the country are intensifying the terror, brutality, murder, and repression of black people.
California lawmakers were terrified. Some reportedly hid under their desks. The entire establishment, including the gun lobby, denounced these armed black people. And the bill, which became known as the Panther Bill, was aimed at taking away what the NRA and the Republicans portrayed as their sacred rights as Americans. In fact, the Panthers in the Capitol that day were charged with felonies.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover today asserted that the Black Panthers represent the greatest internal threat to the nation. Hoover said the Panthers have perpetrated numerous assaults on police and have engaged in violent confrontations throughout the country.
The so-called Panther Bill made one thing abundantly clear. Having armed black revolutionaries patrolling their neighborhoods with weapons was a greater threat than losing the right to openly carry weapons for everyone in California. In fact, this bill resulted in some of the strictest gun control laws anywhere in the United States.
And California still does have some of the strictest gun control laws that began in '67.
All because some black Americans exercised their right to carry loaded weapons.
Again, Jeremy Scahill is the speaker here. He's not advocating one way or the other for more or less gun control. He's simply pointing out the historical connection between, why California began their gun control.
Now, around that same time, major media outlets were aghast as Malcolm X called on black people to arm themselves and to defend themselves against racist violence.
In areas where the police, whether it be federal, state, or city, have proven their inability or their unwillingness to defend Negroes, the lives and the property of Negroes, then it's only intelligent and it's only right that Negroes protect themselves, and I have encouraged them.
And that's also part of that answer, right? He's basically making the argument that the police are unwilling to or unable to protect African Americans. So they then have an obligation to protect themselves.
Buy a rifle and a shotgun, which according to the Constitution is legal.
For what purpose?
So that at any time, anyone makes any effort whatsoever to brutalize them or attack them or endanger them, they should have something to defend themselves.
The history of this reaction by white media to black gun ownership is a very telling one, because it reveals that the sanctity of the Second Amendment for all Americans is a myth. It's a myth today, and it's been a myth from the beginning. The real history of gun laws in the United States is not about hunting, and it's not about fighting tyranny. For the most part, if we're really being honest, it's been about white people having the right to bear arms and use them against black people, indigenous people, and other not real Americans.
He's referring to what we talked about last year in US 1, right? So the philosophical argument in Philadelphia in the 1780s may have been about the ability to have guns and be able to overthrow your government if it becomes tyrannical. But it quickly became something else. It quickly became so white people can have guns to protect themselves from runaway slaves, from angry slaves, and to clear the land of indigenous folks, of people we call Indians, right? We talked about how in some states they would have laws on the books that would require white people to have guns, or that would pay white people if they killed an indigenous person. Right, we talked about that being a redskin. They would scalp the indigenous person and bring it in for payment. All right, that's where the term redskin comes from. So that's what quickly became the history of the Second Amendment.
Just to put this in perspective, more than 80% of gun owners in the United States today are white, and the majority of those are men. And it's
Okay, we don't need the rest of this for the sake of this packet. All right, I just wanted you to get the history behind it and its connection to African Americans. Okay, so there you have it.